Okay, let's talk about how stress affects the brain and therefore employee behavior and performance. So we're going to explore the phenomenon of downshifting. So let's explore the phenomenon of downshifting and what I've found over the years that seems to make it easier for people, rather than first talking about the human brain and how stress affects it, to give examples of the dimensions of downshifting. So one dimension is the intellectual dimension. Let me give you an example of the intellectual facet of downshifting in action. A friend of mine who's an oncologist told me how she learned early on in her career that if she shared with a patient that they did have cancer, nothing she said follow that announcement registered, because the person had intellectually downshifted. They weren't able to process the information. We've all experienced intellectual downshifting where we feel overwhelmed and are just not able to think clearly. Or when we sometimes ask, air quotes, dumb questions when we feel stressed out. So that's an example of the intellectual component of downshifting. There's also an emotional component. An extreme example of the emotional component of downshifting is road rage. But any type of over-the-top emotional response to a situation, whether it's getting feedback, whether it's news about some sort of organizational change, etc., is an example of the emotional component of downshifting, where the person shifts from a rational, reasonable way of being to an overly emotional way of being. The psychological component, obviously psychological and emotional go hand in hand, but the psychological component refers to the phenomenon of age regression. So the more somebody downshifts, the more immature they become. And then last but not least is the physical component. Now, when I think of the physical component of downshifting, I think of two facets. One is behavioral rigidity, and that's where we do the same behavior over and over, even though it's not giving us the results we want. An example that you might relate to, that I think all of us can, is when let's say you're late for a meeting or for work and you can't find your car keys, and you look in your pants pocket, or maybe you look in your pocketbook, they're not there. You look someplace else, you return to your pants pocket or your pocketbook, you look someplace else, you go once again to your pants pocket. And even though we know that makes no sense, we feel compelled to do it. And that's part of the physical rigidity component of downshifting. Again, even though it doesn't make sense, we feel compelled to repeat the behaviors. And there's also the component of the physical component, which is just basically the klutz effect. The more stressed out we are, the more likely we are to stumble, bump into things, drop things, etc., which is one of the reasons why reducing employee stress has a big impact on reducing accidents and injuries. So those are the four dimensions of downshifting. Now, obviously, they can all happen at once. Different dimensions can be more pronounced depending on how downshifted a person is. So now let's look at how the brain is put together, if you will, and how stress affects the human brain. So most people are familiar with the difference in terms of the left brain and the right brain, the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere, that they're structurally somewhat different and they operate somewhat differently. What's far more relevant to the world of work, I believe, is the vertical difference in the brain. More specifically, the top front region, which neurologists sometimes refer to as the executive lobe. This is the prefrontal lobe. And they refer to it as the executive lobe because it's sort of like the CEO of the brain. In many ways, it runs the show, and it integrates what's going on with all the various modules and structures in the brain. Meanwhile, though, among the many structures and substructures in the brain, there's another very primitive region, which is sometimes called the reptilian brain. Dr. Paul MacLean is the one who created that term. And this is an area near the brain stem. It includes the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and other very primitive regions. And the reason why it was named the reptilian brain is that it's believed to be basically very similar to the brain that was present around 200 million years ago when reptiles were the most advanced creatures on Earth. So embedded within our supercomputer fancy human brain, it's almost like a flash drive from many, many millions of years ago. And on that flash drive are hardwired survival programs. And I call it the primitive brain because it reflects the fact that this brain has very primitive roots and still thinks, if you will, still thinks and acts like we live in very primitive law of the jungle, survival of the fittest, caveman, cavewoman contexts. So when people feel rested, they feel safe, they're not stressed out, the executive lobe, again, runs the show, if you will, of the brain. However, when the brain, or more specifically, the primitive region of the brain, perceives threat, so in other words, when we start feeling stressed, it perceives that as a threat and begins to take over. And it's almost like, I think of the reptilian brain as sort of like the neurological bodyguard. Its job is to keep us safe. Its job is to help us survive. And so this neurological bodyguard pushes aside, if you will, the CEO in times of danger. And it runs the show. And those hardwired survival programs, fight or flight is one example. The best defense is a good offense is another example. These hardwired programs kick into gear. Here's an analogy that I hope brings it to life, and it's using the CEO and bodyguard metaphors. So imagine the CEO of a company travels to another country that's very dangerous, and he brings along his bodyguard. And let's say he's walking down the streets of this city in this dangerous country, and some nefarious-looking individuals start to approach. Well, the bodyguard whips into action because that's his job, to protect the CEO. And if this was a scene in an action thriller, he would attack and beat up all the bad guys. In real life, the more typical bodyguard response would be to whisk the CEO away, get him in the car and get out of there. That's the job. That's the bodyguard's job, fight or flight, depending on the context. So those hardwired survival programs allowed us and other animals to survive in that law of the jungle, survival of the fittest context or environment. Now let's say the CEO comes back to the United States and presents to the board his findings. And let's say there's a board member who's has sort of a obnoxious sense of humor and likes to be provocative and irritate people. So he's asking the bodyguard lots of provocative, sort of in-your-face questions. And the CEO starts to get angry. Well, let's say the bodyguard is in the conference room and notices his boss is getting stressed out. And he can hear the tone of voice of his boss start to rise and get tense. And he senses that his boss is feeling attacked. And so he jumps up, runs over to the board member and punches him out. Now, the CEO might be secretly pleased with this, but he tells the bodyguard, like, what are you doing? Like, stop that. And imagine the bodyguard goes, well, geez, boss, I'm just protecting you. Well, that's not the appropriate response when there's social stress or social threat or psychological stress or psychological threat. But here's the deal. The reptilian brain does not know the difference between true physical danger and psychological or social threat. And it just responds when stress levels reaches a certain level. And so that becomes a problem in today's world where most of the time we're not in psychological danger. But situations where we feel psychological or social threat, like being unfairly criticized or getting a work assignment that we don't think we can handle, or dealing with an angry customer, or feeling micromanaged by a boss but being afraid of speaking up. Anything that is experienced as significantly stressful, that reptilian brain, that primitive brain, that inner bodyguard kicks into gear. Okay? I was about to say, so what? I think you've already gotten a clue as to so what, but let's go into a little more detail about why this is a problem. So here's what happens when people downshift. You get a mature, fully functioning adult with their full intellectual capacity. That prefrontal lobe is the repository of the most advanced human components of thinking. So for instance, analytical thought, the ability to plan for the future, the ability to shift gears when plan A doesn't work, the ability to empathize. A lot of emotional intelligence and social intelligence skills depend on a prefrontal lobe being intact. So when a person is upshifted, they're a fully functioning adult. When they start, they become more like a teenager. And think of your own experience working with an adult who might be 30, 40, 50, 60, and they're getting defensive or upset, or their feelings are hurt. And you feel like you're dealing with a surly or rebellious, sarcastic teenager. That's the age regression part of downshifting, the psychological component. When people really downshift a lot, when they're under a whole lot of pressure, they can, downshift to a tantruming little kid. And I'm sure you've seen that behavior. And what's interesting is, as the prefrontal lobe, the executive lobe, gives way to the primitive brain, all those neural structure, or sometimes called the neural architecture, neural hardware that allows us to be fully functioning adult, goes offline. And so what we're left to function with is basically the brain developmental level of a little child. Because small children, the reason why they have a temper tantrum, or little babies freak out if they're tired or hungry, is they don't have all the extra neural architecture that adults have to modulate their emotional state. It's just like an on and off switch. And so when adults downshift in a big way, they don't have that modulating ability, that self-soothing, that get back to baseline capacity. And so maturity-wise, they're like a little kid. And even worse, maybe you've worked with people like this, when people really downshift to full-on reptilian brain, primitive brain, inner Neanderthal hardwired programs, they're basically acting like a caveman or a cavewoman. And again, road rage is a classic example of that. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this, this is based on the research of Dr. Paul MacLean. He was the person who coined the term the reptilian brain. And I actually was lucky enough to interview him twice before he passed away. And one of the things he said I found incredibly fascinating is he said his research with reptiles, it was somewhere around a decade's worth of research. He said, my research with reptiles gave me more insight into human nature than all my psychiatric internships and residencies. He was a psychiatrist, he was an MD, but he did research his whole life. And if you read any of his scientific papers or this book, The Triune Brain and Evolution, you can see what he's talking about in terms of a lot of the behavior so that we see in human beings, like posturing, territoriality, the need for power and control, xenophobia, the fear of foreigners, etc. A lot of the primitive primal roots of our behavior reside in reptiles. In fact, there's a field called paleopsychology, which looks at the paleo roots of our human behavior. So I actually already alluded to some of these hardwired programs, but I'll go through them very briefly now. So when that reptilian brain is activated, when somebody is downshifted because they're stressed out, it triggers paranoia. And you think, in the law of the jungle, 'tis better to assume evil intention and be proved wrong than to assume good intention and proved wrong. You think about that. From a survival point of view, it's way more effective to be paranoid. Kind of problematic in an organization where you need people to work well together, where you need people to trust each other, where you need trust and rapport between labor and management, where you need trust and rapport between different departments. The more people downshift, the more paranoid they are. Think for a moment the implications that has for major changes in an organization. So if at the baseline, the workforce is downshifted because they're stressed out and overwhelmed, and then some major change initiative is announced, because they're operating out of that downshifted mode, they're likely to be very paranoid in terms of their interpretation of the intention behind the change. I mentioned xenophobia, the fear of foreigners. It makes sense from a survival point of view. If you're in a tribe, to think if you're not one of us, you are one of them. Because back in caveman, cavewoman days, if somebody was from another tribe, they were probably there to do you harm. As I say when I'm speaking to groups, back in the day, there wasn't a big tourism industry. And so if somebody was from away, if somebody was a foreigner, they weren't there as a tourist. And so it makes sense to have an instantaneous assessment. Are you one of us or are you not one of us? And then if you assess the person is not one of your tribe, to be suspicious of them. Now think for a moment of xenophobia in the workplace, or cousins of xenophobia. So for instance, discord between generations, discord between ethnicities, discord between departments, say production versus the front office, sales versus service. Again, as I mentioned before, labor versus management. When a workforce is downshifted, they have that us versus them xenophobic mentality. Another hardwired program in the reptilian brain is neophobia, fear of anything new. New is bad. The familiar has kept us alive and therefore is good. Now, it makes sense from a survival point of view to stick with the tried and true. Example that oftentimes I use with groups is, imagine you're a caveman or a cavewoman foraging out in a field, let's say a couple hundred yards from your cave, and you see a saber-toothed tiger. And you've got a path to your cave, and let's say it's a little bit twisting and turning because it goes around a few rocks and it's sort of easy. You don't have to climb up over a hill, whatever. Now, if you see the saber-toothed tiger, which is more conducive to your getting to your cave and to safety, to try to figure out a new and improved path, or stick with the tried and true? Now, obviously, stick with the tried and true because it takes no computing power. And so under situations of threat, we tend to stick with the tried and true. The familiar is good because the familiar has allowed us to survive, and trying to figure out something new will take computing power, and that could get us killed because we need to put all our computing power on watching the aggressor, the predator. And we can't be figuring things out. We want to go on autopilot. So when employees are downshifted, when day in and day out they're stressed out and overwhelmed, then anything new is automatically seen as bad. Territoriality. Must have a safe zone. Must protect our source of survival. I mean, we see that in all aspects of the animal kingdom. Having territories and protecting the territory makes total sense from a survival point of view. Well, when people downshift, that territoriality imperative kicks into gear, and you see people protecting their turf. You see turf battles. Think of how oftentimes that happens and how it gets in the way of operational efficiency and effectiveness. So when people are upshifted, when a workforce is upshifted, then it's we're all in this together, we're a team. When they're downshifted, again, it's that tribal, protect your territory attitude. The drive for power and control. In the jungle, the strong survive. This is one of the most compelling reasons to learn how to not downshift other people, or how to not trigger downshifting in other people. And when I do programs on constructive conversations, a lot of the focus of our work is on what to do before the conversation so you're not downshifted, and so you don't go into the conversation in an antagonistic or judgmental frame of mind, which will instantly trigger downshifting in the other person. And when that happens, one of the primitive responses it will trigger is the drive for power and control. And then also, if you're going to engage people in constructive conversations, how to actually start off the conversation and use language that helps the person stay upshifted so that inner Neanderthal doesn't get triggered. Because when somebody is downshifted, the claws and the fangs come out. And there's that primal, eat or be eaten response. And so that's the fight back or die. The best defense is a good offense. So there's a saying that Martha Beck has, which I love. She says, when people act scary, it's because they're scared. And she refers to the reptilian brain. So when people act aggressive, antagonistic, like power-hungry maniacs, it's a good indication that the reptilian brain has been triggered, that inner Neanderthal has been triggered. In fact, there's a great book, Neanderthals at Work, that I highly recommend that you read. In fact, even though I love Paul MacLean's work because I love reading scientific articles on topics that I enjoy, Neanderthals at Work is a much easier read and more obviously directly applicable to the workplace, because he takes Albert Rosen is a psychologist and Sidney Rosen is a professional writer. Bernstein takes Dr. Paul MacLean's work and applies it to the workplace. So that's how stress affects the human brain and the phenomenon of downshifting. So hopefully it's clear why it's so important to create a work environment where employees are not chronically downshifted, as well as why it's so important to recognize how we sometimes trigger people to downshift when we talk with them, how to avoid that, and then to have the skills of upshifting people if they do become downshifted. So stress, downshifting, and the human brain. Okay, let's talk about how stress affects the brain and therefore employee behavior and performance.